We are Campaign Force. This is the Veterans in Politics podcast. Let's introduce you to our guest.
In this episode, we speak to veteran in politics James Sunderland MP. James very recently left the army as a full colonel after a career spanning decades and is the senior ranked veteran alongside Colonel Bob Stewart in the House of Commons. We think James holds the record for the quickest transition from army service to standing up and serving again in politics, having completed all of this in just 6 days when he then found himself as an election candidate. We speak to him about this, and he goes on to reveal an amusing anecdote about his first encounter knocking on doors in that election. You just never know who you might meet. It's time for you to listen to the conversation.
So without further ado, I just want to introduce very briefly James Sunderland. James and I first met last year at a Conservative Party conference, and was brilliant with some initial advice as a new organisation starting up. To have James come across and give some initial feedback was really generous of him, and we've stayed in touch since. It was absolutely awesome to see him elected as the Member of Parliament for Bracknell, and a constituency that covers Sandhurst, of all places, which many of you on the call will remember fondly. And indeed, James, interesting fact, is the most senior ranked veteran in the House of Commons, alongside our good friend Colonel Bob Stewart. So we are delighted to have James and his experience, his military experience, decades of military experience, and see that as we evangelise, transferred into the world of politics. So welcome, James. Just want to say hello to the gang. What have you been up to today?
Great to see you. And this is really important for me because I've just transitioned out of the armed forces. I did it in 6 days, which I think is a record. But having gone through that journey and jumped into public life, I do have some nuggets, I hope, for you. And, the message really for me this evening is, do not underestimate who you are, and do not underestimate the skills that you've got, because by God, you are good. And Civvy Street will stamp you up, no problem at all, for those that are still transitioning. For me, it's great optimism, and we're in a good place, I think.
Well, we're delighted to have you here, particularly, James, as you already alluded to. That kind of flash to bang. We had Dan Jarvis the other week, who had a similar kind of story to tell, a very short transition from the military right into politics. But why on earth did you choose to become an MP in the first place?
I wish I knew, actually. Having just had the entire week, the last 10 days, dealing with very angry constituents over the Dominic Cummings issue, I feel almost broken at the moment. And I've got a safe seat. So I hate to think what our red wall MPs are thinking of at the moment. But I think, to answer the question directly, I've been on the circuit for a while, actually. I have helped Gerald Howarth and Aldershot with his electioneering from 2010, been a party member. The itch has always been there, but it got to a point where it became a bit of a scratch and then a festering sore, and I could ignore it no longer. So when I left command of 27 Regiment, I made the decision there and then to go for the Parliamentary Assessment Board. I got through that in 2017, and been working quite hard behind the scenes, not overtly, because you can't really do that as a serving officer, but getting to know people, just, doing the leaflets and that sort of thing, stuff that I wouldn't get caught doing. And then the opportunity arose for Bracknell, and I jumped at it.
Amazing. I mean, you've already alluded to the fact that you did go for Parliamentary Assessment Board back in 2017, obviously following your command, but what groundwork was required whilst you were still serving? How did you prepare? Because as we know, it's quite difficult, quite restrictive as someone serving in the military. What were you able to do? What kind of advice can you offer those dialing in this evening that might still be serving, thinking about it?
Well, I mean, I had 2 jobs in a row that were a gift for me. Commanding officer in Aldershot. I was a task force commander, as Canon Peter Bruinvels knows, for West Surrey. So you get to meet people on the civilian side of life. And also, it's very important that we maintain those contacts in civilian life. And then when I became the commander of the Army Engagement Group, I had 2.5 years, the best job in the Army by a country mile. And it was a case of getting to know people, councillors, politicians, just doing the networking. And I can't stress enough how important networking is. I mean, I hate the word myself, but actually it's quite surprising how many people you do accumulate over the years in terms of networks. And because my networks were so good, I just made a point of going out there, meeting as many MPs and councillors and serious people as possible. And I suppose without droning on, for me, I just got lucky. I think I just met the right people at the right time. The opportunity came along. As I said, I went for it.
So do you think, in terms of the networking piece, is that something that lends itself naturally for those with a military background? Did you find it quite easy in that role? And in terms of that transferable skill into politics?
Yeah, I mean, you'd be amazed at how transferable your skills are. Whether it's communication skills or leadership, teamwork, that sense of loyalty, integrity, camaraderie. I mean, civilian life is crying out for that. And I can tell you, having just gone through it, that your stock and our stock as service personnel is really high. People will pay top dollar for those skills. And we don't realise we've got those skills until we get out there and see what's around us. But, do not undersell yourself at all. And I didn't. I was very lucky in the sense I knew what I wanted to do. And as I said, I can talk about the Pacific story. It's quite an interesting one with after Bracknell phoned me what happened then. But as I said, it was because I was well placed, because I'd shaped it, because I've been on the circuit for so long, that actually I knew exactly what was going to happen when it happened.
Okay. So in terms of that transition journey, many people will be familiar of going through the Career Transition Partnership and going through various workshops and preparing the ground so it's as soft as possible for when they land in Civilian Street. Did you have, what was harder, transitioning out of the military or transitioning into politics? What would you say is out of the two?
I mean, but both difficult. I think the benefits of the CTP, whether you're 2 years out or 6 months out, what's really important there is that what you're doing is you're preparing, you're planning, you're shaping your future. And without me really realising it, I had been shaping my future for 3 years before I actually left the army, because I was pretty clear on what I wanted to do. And when Boris Johnson called the election, it suddenly happened very quickly because so many members of Parliament resigned at that time. So many vacancies suddenly became available. And actually, if I'm being candid with you, CCHQ, I think, was scrabbling for candidates. So they had to resort, to sort of scraping the barrel for me. But as I said, but John, just to drone on for a second, I think the important thing for me was that leaving the army is not easy, but the CTP is designed to help you through that, so that the day you hand your ID card in, you're already a civilian, in many ways. And I didn't really think about it at all. I didn't have a chance to, because when you go from one institution to the next, I was in head first, learning curve absolutely vertical. I didn't even have a chance to think, oh my God, I've left the army. I mean, it was literally, I'll tell you a funny story very quickly. When I got the call from Bracknell on the Monday morning, I was told, put your CV into Bracknell. The CV went in on the Wednesday, I was shortlisted, and on the Friday, I went to the selection meeting. And I turned up, to my dismay, there were 2 other ex-military candidates there. So Bracknell had shortlisted an all-military shortlist. I got through on the night. I found that quite a stressful experience, but I was well prepared for it by virtue of being the Army Engagement Group commander. And then I've got to tell you this. It's a great story. And then what happened was that night, at midnight that night, having been selected as a candidate, I went into Sandhurst, opened my computer up, and I PVR'd there and there at the machine.
Wow.
And I put in for something called a non-compliant PVR. And when you tick the box that says parliamentary candidate, all sorts of things happen very quickly.
So there's a box in there for parliamentary candidate?
Yeah, there is. You specify at the bottom parliamentary candidate. There's a little box that you tick.
Okay.
Hasn't happened very often to my knowledge. I think Dan Jarvis was the last one that did that. But all sorts of things happen. And then the following morning, on Saturday morning, I was woken quite early from Glasgow. My desk officer, what on earth are you doing? You've just PVR'd. I know. Why have you PVR'd? I've just become a parliamentary candidate. When do you want to go? And I said, well, the election's in 4 weeks' time. I need to go now. And he said, well, you can't because you've got a 7 months notice period. And I said, well, I really want to go now. So he said, okay, fine, get back to you. And then on Monday morning, CGS's outer office phoned me and said, James, what have you done? When do you want to go? And I said, now. And then for the rest of that week, having been a candidate, I couldn't knock on doors. I couldn't canvass at all. Wow. So that was a week of the campaigning gone. And then a brilliant last anecdote. on the Saturday morning, having just become a civilian, and the very first house we came to, we knocked on the door, and this chap I recognised came to the door and said, "Oh, I've already voted for you, you can go away." And it was Sir John Redwood.
Hello, it's your host Johnny here. Sorry to interrupt, I'll be very brief. If you're getting value from this conversation, don't forget to put something in the comments below, but more importantly, hit subscribe so you don't miss out on future conversations.
And I said, "Sir John, what a great start to my political career, knocking on your door and getting that wrong." But 3 weeks later, went to the count in Bracknell, won the seat, and became an MP. And it has been quite daunting, yes.
Wow, that's amazing. I guess you've not, what a story. I guess you've not really had time to think about what it means to be a veteran and, you know, that kind of transition. We've spoken about this quite a lot on the call, actually, about the identity, authenticity, who you are, particularly those that have left the armed forces. It's something I've come across when working around employer engagement, and people come to terms of, you know, when they're getting themselves ready for their careers. But your sort of flash to bang, as I said, has been so short, and how you've had to kind of overcome that and sorting out the family and all those bits and pieces. It's doesn't even bear thinking about. Yeah, I think
Well, it was interesting, actually, having first become a candidate, because people just went for me straight away. I mean, you know, the activists in Bracknell were quite active. They went for me. The Lib Dem candidate called me a liar on the first 4 occasions I met him. And, of course, and Labour, being particularly active in Bracknell, were all over me as well. But in a strange sort of way, I had a very easy campaign, and I've had a very easy run as a Member of Parliament, I think, because of my background. And people, I think, are wary of me, and people don't want to take me on. And I think coming into public life with that credibility of being a serviceman has given me a bit of an advantage, I think, in terms of protocol. But we could talk about Parliament and the way it operates, but I felt all the way through that I was still an army officer. I don't think I've really left in my mind. I think I'm still serving in my mind. I'm just going to work in a suit. And because I'm so passionate about the armed forces and the army in particular, you know, I tend to be a champion for the army. And actually, I do see myself as being more vocal in the House about military matters. But when you've got 4 good ministers, all 4 ministers in the MOD are all ex-military, there's fantastic credibility there. And I think we're very well served at the moment by ex-military personnel in politics. 45, of course, in the House.
Yep, indeed. And we released that research afterwards, and it was great to see you on that list. And you've already mentioned about the kind of things you've had to dig deep into. You've mentioned service. You already feel like you are continuing to serve, which is great to hear. Are there any kind of specific skills that have got you through, let's say, some difficult times already? Because let's face it, there has been some pretty ugly periods within the first few months of this Parliament.
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways it hasn't been too bad, because there's a great sense of camaraderie amongst the Tory MPs. And I think
previous people have mentioned the 109, that kind of back to the new intake, and we've had quite a few of that intake on these chats.
Yeah, the 109 groups, we call ourselves, it's actually 107 people, but we call it 109 for some bizarre reason. In fact, the reason behind that is because Conservative Home counted wrong. They counted it as 109 and released an article that there were 109 new Tory MPs in the House, actually 107. So it's quite a nice little quirky story that we're still the 109. But yeah, it's a great sense of camaraderie, ranging in age from 25, Sarah Brickliff, of course, up to somebody, I think, in their 60s. So it's a real spread of experience. But I'll tell you this, and I don't want to be political at all, fantastic bunch of people, a fantastic group of very left-leaning, very grounded new MPs. And, you know, even now, you know, Boris has realised that he cannot operate without the 109. When you're 1/3 of the Parliamentary Party, you know, and you're there to make a bit of a stamp, it's quite a powerful group. But it has been great. And I can see no weakness there either. I can genuinely look at the 109 new MPs, myself accepting perhaps, and think that CCHQ probably got it right.
Mega. Well, that's certainly been our experience from the Conservative side that we've seen on these calls. I mean, Alicia Kearns and Darren Henry recently, we've had on these calls, Stuart Anderson, all from that new batch, and we've been deeply impressed by their authenticity, their experience and their reaction and how they've handled the questions from this audience. But in terms of you've said that you're there to champion the armed forces, which, preaching to the choir here, but what do you really hope to achieve as a member of Parliament? Short, medium, long term, any big things that you hope to achieve?
Well, I think first and foremost, I'm there to serve my constituents. I mean, Bracknell's given me the opportunity. I feel hugely privileged to have had the opportunity, and I'm there to serve them. So that comes first. But as I was reminded this week, of course, I've been attacked quite a lot for my stance on Dominic Cummings. I'm with the Parliamentary Party on that, and that's been the first big test for me. I'm now blooded in battle, and I won't go into too much detail. But the bottom line is, when you set your stall out and you make a decision, and you come out on public record, you're damned if you don't, and you're damned if you do. And that's one of the perils that we all have going to public life. You cannot sit on the fence. I call it the 3-boat analogy. I could have got in one boat and said nothing, and that would have been unforgivable. Moral courage, integrity, constituents need to know. So we waited and waited and waited. We then got in a boat, which was to support the government. I was very critical of the individual, but loyal towards the Prime Minister, and that caused fury amongst the opposition in Bracknell. But of course, had I come out and said, actually, he was wrong and he must resign and must be sacked, then that would have caused fury with the Conservatives. So you have got to play it really carefully and also be true to yourself.
Is there any golden nuggets of advice from the first few months, from your relatively short journey from military service, transitioning into political service? For the guys on the call right now, what would be a couple of little ditties you'd give for them to go away and think about if they're considering public life, whether that be local government or Parliament?
I think the first thing is that when you're serving, there is a certain reliability around you. People think the same, they act the same, they're well trained. I call it unifying purpose. There is a wonderful unifying purpose in the military, in any unit, where people work together towards a common aim. That is not the same in Civvy Street. And I think having to deal with the different forces pulling against each other. I met more shits, I think, in the first 27 days of Parliament than I met in 27 years in the army. And I think in many ways, you've got to set your stall. If you're going to be true to yourself, then be true to your principles and don't allow things around you to affect the way that you think. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is, it is a dog-eat-dog world out there. Clearly, I'm in politics, it's going to be. But actually, and I know we can't get political, but the opposition are very clever. They're very good. I mean, at the moment, if I can mention Labour, they're clever people. They know your weaknesses. They're running an insurgency campaign. It's the classic Marxist principles of disrupt, deny, delay, destroy. That's what they do. So you have to get used very quickly to the personal attacks. You've got to get used to it coming in at every angle, 24 hours a day. Just get used to the negativity and the trolling. For me, I'm very lucky. It's water for duck's back. It doesn't bother me at all. But I think you just need to be able to operate very quickly in an environment which is alien to the one that you're used to.
Well, counterinsurgencies for many of us won't be, of course, but albeit we don't expect to fight it on the home front in that way. And I've spoken about it before, the transferable skills, the experience of some of the more practical skills of fighting counterinsurgency and how you are in a constituency, in a campaign completely. If you get your head set in that frame of mind, it will certainly do you some favours when looking at politics, that's for sure.
Thanks to our guests and thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, hit subscribe now. Alternatively, you can support our mission by checking out in the show notes below, where you can rate, donate, or become our mate. Thank you.